He helped two young women on the road, but their father was the man who destroyed his life. Michael Gardner was driving along Interstate 95 when he saw the two figures in the torrential rain. Two young twins, apparently around 20 years old, were walking soaked along the roadside, their red dresses plastered to their bodies by the mercilessly falling water. That's when one of the girls waved desperately in his direction. Michael slowed down and stopped the car a few meters ahead. Through the rearview mirror, he watched the two approaching, running, their blonde hair stuck to their faces, shivering from the cold. "Please, sir, can you give us a ride?" shouted one of them as soon as Michael opened the window. "Our car broke down more than 2 hours ago and we can't get a cell phone signal." Michael hesitated for a moment. At 52, he had learned to be cautious with strangers, but the rain was getting heavier, and those girls seemed genuinely desperate. "Of course, get in quickly before you get even wetter," he replied, unlocking the doors. The twins climbed into the back seat, thanking him through chattering teeth. Michael turned the heater on full blast and offered some towels he kept in the car. "I'm Michael," he said, adjusting the rearview mirror to look at the young women. "And you?" "I'm Jessica," replied one of them, drying her face. "And I'm Emily," added the other, practically identical to her sister. "Twins, I imagine," commented Michael with a half-smile. "Where do you need to go?" The girls exchanged a somewhat hesitant look. "Actually, Mr. Michael, our situation is a bit complicated," began Jessica. "We kind of ran away from home." Michael felt a tightness in his chest. This situation was becoming more complex than he had imagined. "Ran away from home?" he repeated, trying to keep his voice calm. "May I know why?" "Our father, he's very controlling," explained Emily. Her voice choked. "Yesterday we had a terrible fight with him. He doesn't let us have our own lives. We can't date. We can barely leave the house." "We want to go to New York, where our aunt lives," added Jessica. "She always said that if we ever needed help, we could count on her." Michael drove in silence for a few minutes, processing the information. The girls seemed to have a refined upbringing, expensive clothes even when wet, and spoke with the characteristic accent of the more affluent families from upstate New York. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. "And your phones really don't work?" asked Michael. "They work, but we don't want to call anyone yet," admitted Emily. "Our father must be furious. He'll try to convince us to come back, and we don't want to hear that right now." "I understand," murmured Michael. He himself had gone through family conflicts in the past and knew how painful these situations could be. "Well, New York is at least 4 hours from here, and with this rain it will take even longer. How about we stop at some hotel so you can dry off properly and rest? Tomorrow morning I can take you there." The twins looked at each other again, and Michael saw gratitude in their eyes. "You would really do that for us?" asked Jessica. "Of course. I have a daughter about your age. I know how complicated it is when parents are too strict. In truth, Michael hadn't spoken to his own daughter in over 2 years. Rachel had moved to Los Angeles after an argument about her career choices, and since then they had only had sporadic contact via text. He knew he had been too hard on her, exactly like those controlling parents the girls were trying to avoid. "What are your full names?" asked Michael, trying to make conversation while looking for a hotel sign on the road. "Jessica and Emily Patterson Hayes," answered Jessica. Michael almost lost control of the steering wheel. Patterson Hayes. That surname echoed in his mind like a punch to the gut. It couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't be... "Patterson Hayes?" he repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. "And what's your father's full name?" "Richard Patterson Hayes," said Emily, without suspecting a thing. "He has a construction company here in the region. Why do you know him?" Michael's world collapsed. Richard Patterson Hayes, the man who 20 years ago had completely destroyed his life. The businessman who, through fraudulent contracts and questionable legal maneuvers, had driven his small family business into bankruptcy. The same man who, after the bankruptcy, still sued Michael for slander when he tried to report the irregularities. Michael remembered every detail of those hellish months. How Richard had approached him, offering a promising partnership. how he had convinced Michael to invest all his savings in a joint project, and how he then simply disappeared with the money, leaving him with insurmountable debt. The bankruptcy hadn't just taken his money, it had cost him his marriage, as his wife Jennifer couldn't withstand the financial and emotional pressure. It had cost him his relationship with his daughter, who at the time was only 15 and didn't understand why her father had become a bitter and resentful person. It had cost him his home, his dreams, his dignity. "Mr. Michael, are you okay?" asked Jessica, worried. "You've gone very pale." I'm fine," lied Michael, his hands trembling on the wheel. "I'm just looking for a place to stop." He spotted a small roadside hotel and decided to stop there. He needed time to process that surreal situation. The daughters of the man who had destroyed his life were in his car, asking for his help. "We'll stay here tonight," announced Michael, parking in front of the hotel. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." The hotel was simple but clean. Michael paid for 2 rooms, one for the girls and one for him. While they went up to take a hot shower and change, he stayed in the lobby, trying to decide what to do. The irony of the situation was disturbing. For 20 years he had dreamed of an opportunity to confront Richard Patterson Hayes, to get justice, to at least look the man in the eyes and tell him how much he had suffered because of his actions. And now fate had placed that man's daughters in his hands. They were vulnerable, trusted him, and clearly had problems with their father. It would be the perfect revenge. He could use the girls to hurt Richard in the most painful way possible, by messing with what he loved most. But as Michael plotted revenge in his mind, the image of the 2 young women shivering from the cold in his car wouldn't leave his thoughts. They weren't to blame for their father's crimes. They were just 2 girls who had argued with an authoritarian father and were trying to find their own way. Jessica and Emily came down an hour later, wearing dry clothes they had bought at the hotel's small shop. They looked much more relaxed and grateful. "Mr. Michael, we don't know how to thank you," said Emily. "You saved our lives today." "It was nothing," replied Michael, still wrestling with his own inner demons. "Have you had dinner?" "We don't have money for dinner," admitted Jessica. "We left home with just the clothes on our backs and our cards, but we're afraid to use them because our father might track them." "I'll pay for dinner. Let's just go to the restaurant here in the hotel." During the meal, Michael heard more details about the girls' lives. Richard, apparently, was truly an absent and controlling father. He worked all the time, was rarely present at home, and when he was, he imposed strict rules about practically everything in his daughters' lives. "He doesn't even let us mention our mother," Emily said sadly. "She passed away when we were 8, and ever since it's as if she never existed." "Do you miss her?" asked Michael. "Very much," replied Jessica. "But our father removes all the photos, doesn't let us visit the grave or even talk about her. He says it's better to forget the past." Michael felt a pang in his chest. He himself had made a similar mistake with his daughter Rachel, distancing her from her mother's family after the divorce. Pride and bitterness had spoken louder than the child's well-being. "And why did you argue specifically yesterday?" Michael wanted to know. The twins exchanged a knowing glance. "We found some old letters in his office," revealed Jessica, lowering her voice. "Letters our mother wrote before she died. In them, she talked about a sister who lived in New York, our Aunt Christine. We discovered we have maternal family that our father has hidden from us all these years. When we confronted him about it, he became furious," continued Emily. "He said we didn't need anyone but him, that family were bad people who only wanted to harm us. But in the letters, our mother spoke so highly of her sister. That's when we decided to run away," concluded Jessica. "We want to meet our aunt, learn about our mother, about our family. We have a right to that, don't we?" Michael nodded, increasingly disturbed by the similarities between Richard and himself. Both had used the pain of loss to justify distancing their daughters from their maternal families. Both had thought they were protecting the girls, when in fact they were only feeding their own wounded pride. "Of course you have that right," agreed Michael. "Family is important." After dinner, Michael accompanied the girls to their room, making sure they were safe. When he was finally alone in his own room, the reality of the situation hit him with full force. Richard Patterson Hayes's daughters were there, trusting him, telling their most intimate secrets. They had argued with their father and run away from home. They were vulnerable and isolated. It was the perfect opportunity for a devastating revenge. All Michael needed to do was call Richard and tell him where his daughters were. But instead of simply returning them, he could make demands. He could humiliate the man, force him to beg, maybe even make him publicly admit what he had done 20 years ago. Or else, Michael could simply not call. He could leave Richard in despair, searching for his daughters for days, weeks perhaps. The man's suffering would be proportional to the suffering he had caused. But as Michael considered his revenge options, the dinner conversation echoed in his mind. The girls were motherless, just as his own daughter had been after the divorce. They had been deprived of knowing their maternal family, exactly as he had deprived Rachel. They were running away from a controlling, absent father, exactly the kind of father he himself had become. The resemblance was too disturbing to ignore. Michael spent a sleepless night, debating with himself. With each passing hour, his thirst for revenge diminished a little, while his genuine concern for the girls grew. They were not pawns in a chess game. They were two young women who needed help rebuilding their family relationship. The next morning, during breakfast, Jessica casually mentioned something that made Michael's blood run cold. "Our father always talks about a man he met many years ago," she said, spreading jam on her bread. "Someone who tried to harm his company with lies. Daddy always says that man got what he deserved." "Deserved what?" asked Michael, feigning casualness. "Well, Daddy never gave details, but he said the man was left in misery after trying to swindle our family," explained Emily. "Daddy always uses that story as an example of how dishonest people end up being punished by life." Michael nearly choked on his coffee. For 20 years, Richard had twisted the story, turning himself from the villain into the victim. He had taught his daughters that Michael was the criminal, the dishonest man who had tried to harm them and was rightly punished for it. The discovery was like a slap in the face. Richard had not only destroyed his life, but had also rewritten history to cast himself as the hero. This made the situation even more complex and painful. "What was that man's name?" asked Michael, trying to keep his voice steady. "Michael Gardner," answered Jessica without hesitation. "Daddy always says he was a bitter, envious man who tried to destroy our family." The silence that followed was deafening. The twins continued eating naturally, unaware of the impact of their words. Michael felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. They knew his name. For years, Richard had spoken of him as the villain of the family story. And now they were here, being helped by the very man their father had taught them to hate without even knowing it. Do you believe your father's version?" asked Michael carefully. Jessica shrugged. "I don't know. We never met this Michael Gardner, but Daddy usually doesn't lie about these things. He can be controlling, but he's always been honest with us." "Yeah," agreed Emily, "although in recent years I've noticed Daddy sometimes exaggerates his stories. He always paints people as either saints or demons. There's never a middle ground." "Why do you want to know about this?" asked Jessica, finally paying attention to Michael's reaction. "Just curious," lied Michael. "It's just that I once knew someone by that name." The rest of breakfast passed in relative silence. Michael could barely focus on the girls' conversation about their plans to get to their aunt in New York. His mind was processing the magnitude of the situation. Not only were his enemy's daughters in his hands, they had been raised believing he was the villain of the story. Richard had used his very existence as a negative moral example throughout their upbringing. The irony was so intense it bordered on absurd. After breakfast, Michael announced he needed to make some work calls and went up to the bedroom. In truth, he needed to definitively decide what to do about this situation. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Michael took out his cell phone and found Richard Patterson Hayes's number online. For 20 years, he had avoided any contact with that man. But now, he had a reason to break that silence. His fingers hovered over the keypad for long minutes. A single call could change everything. He could finally confront Richard, using his own daughters as leverage. He could force the man to admit the truth, to apologize, to pay for what he had done. But as Michael imagined the conversation, a painful memory came to his mind. 2 years ago, when Rachel had called for the last time, She had said something that had marked him deeply. "Dad, you've become such a bitter person that I don't even recognize who you were anymore. Everything in your life revolves around this anger from the past. I need to step away because I don't want to become like that too." That was exactly what was happening. 20 years later, Michael was still letting Richard Patterson Hayes control his life, his decisions, his emotions. The difference was that now he had the power to strike back. But did he really want to remain the bitter man his daughter had rejected? Michael put away the phone without making the call. When he went down to meet the girls, they were in the lobby, chatting excitedly about the aunt they hoped to see in New York. "Girls, change of plans," announced Michael. "Before I take you to New York, I think you should try to talk to your father." Their expressions changed immediately. "No way," protested Jessica. "He'll force us to go back home, and we'll never have the courage to leave again." "And besides, we're scared of his reaction," added Emily. "He must be furious." "I imagine he is," agreed Michael, "but he must also be worried. Whatever his flaws as a father, I'm sure he loves you." "How can you be so sure?" asked Jessica. Michael thought of his own daughter, of all the nights he had lain awake over the past 2 years, worried about her, wishing he had the courage to call and apologize. "Because even the most flawed parents in the world love their children," he answered sincerely. "The problem is we don't always know how to show that love in the right way." The twins exchanged glances, clearly torn between their desire for independence and their concern for their father. "But if we call him, it'll all be over," said Emily. "He'll come get us and nothing will change." "Not necessarily," pondered Michael. "You could suggest meeting him on neutral ground, right here at the hotel, for example. Explain how you feel, what you want, and listen to his side too." "And if he doesn't accept our terms?" questioned Jessica. "Then you really will leave for New York," said Michael. "At least you'll have tried to resolve things in the most mature way possible." The girls spent the entire morning debating the proposal. Michael noticed that despite their hurt, they clearly missed their father and were worried about him. The anger was mixed with love, a complex combination he knew all too well. In the late afternoon, Jessica finally relented. "Okay, we'll call him, but if he comes here yelling and making a scene, we're leaving right away." "Fair enough," agreed Michael. "Do you want me to stay nearby during the conversation?" "Please," asked Emily. "You've been like a father to us these last few hours. It would be good to have someone on our side." The irony of those words struck Michael like lightning. In less than 24 hours, he had been more of a father to Richard's daughters than Richard had probably been to them in months. And they didn't even know who he really was. Jessica made the call. Michael stayed close, hearing only her side of the conversation, trying to imagine Richard's reactions on the other end of the line. "Hi, Dad." "Yes, we're fine." "No, we're not going to say where we are yet." "Dad, stop yelling. We wanted to talk to you. In person." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Jessica alternating between firmness and emotion. Finally, she hung up. "He's coming here," she announced. "He'll arrive in 2 hours. He said he's desperate and that he's willing to listen to anything we want." "Great," said Michael, although his stomach was in knots. "You did the right thing." The next 2 hours passed in a mix of nervousness and anticipation. The girls rehearsed what they wanted to say, while Michael mentally prepared for the meeting he had postponed for 20 years. At 7 o'clock sharp, a black Lexus pulled into the hotel parking lot. Michael watched from the lobby window as a man in his 50s hurriedly got out of the car. It was Richard Patterson Hayes, 20 years older, with more grey hair and a few more wrinkles, but he was still unmistakably the man who had destroyed his life. Michael felt a mix of anger, anxiety, and, strangely, a certain curiosity about what it would finally be like to meet him face to face. Richard entered the hotel like a hurricane, his eyes scanning the room until he located his daughters. When he saw them sitting on the lobby sofa, his face completely transformed. The authoritative posture vanished, replaced by palpable emotional relief. "Girls!" he exclaimed, running toward them. Jessica and Emily stood up, and for a moment Michael thought they would run into their father's arms, but instead they maintained a respectful distance, clearly still hurt. "Dad, did you come alone as you promised?" asked Emily. "Of course I came alone," replied Richard, his voice choked. "I was so worried. You have no idea what I've been through in the last 24 hours. "We've been through a lot too," Jessica retorted. "That's why we wanted to talk." It was at that moment that Richard noticed Michael sitting in a nearby armchair. His eyes narrowed slightly, clearly wondering who this stranger was. "Dad, this is Mr. Michael," said Emily. "He helped us when our car broke down on the highway. If it weren't for him, we would have been sleeping in the car last night." Richard approached Michael, extending his hand in greeting. "Thank you so much for looking after my daughters," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "I don't know how I can thank you." Michael accepted the handshake, his eyes fixed on Richard's. For a second that seemed eternal, he considered revealing his identity right then and there, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the vulnerability on the man's face, or perhaps it was the presence of the girls. "It was nothing," he replied simply. "They are very special girls." "They are," agreed Richard, looking at his daughters with a mixture of love and regret. "And I have been a terrible father to them." The spontaneous admission caught everyone by surprise, especially the twins. Jessica and Emily exchanged glances, clearly not expecting their father to start the conversation with a confession. "Dad?" began Jessica. "Dunno, let me speak first," interrupted Richard. "I spent the whole night thinking, and you are right, I have been too controlling, too absent, too rigid. When you disappeared, I realized I was losing the two most important people in my life because of my own pride." Michael watched the scene with a mixture of surprise and discomfort. This was not the Richard Patterson Hayes he had imagined for 20 years. The man before him seemed genuinely remorseful and vulnerable. "About Mom's letters," began Emily hesitantly. Richard sighed deeply. "I know. You had every right to know, Aunt Christine. I deprived you of that out of selfish fear. I was afraid you would leave, that you would like her family more than me." "But Dad, why did you never tell us about her?" asked Jessica. "Why did you hide that we had more family?" "Because after your mother passed away, I became very afraid of losing you too," admitted Richard, his voice almost a whisper. "Her family always thought I wasn't good enough for your mother. When she was gone, they wanted to take custody of you, and I panicked. I thought if you met that family, you would realize I really wasn't a good father." Richard's words echoed in Michael's mind, like a distorted echo of his own fears. How many times had he felt inadequate as a father? How many times had the fear of not being good enough led him to make wrong decisions? "Dad, you are our father," said Emily emotionally. "That will never change, but we also wanted to know Mom's family, to better understand who she was." "I know," agreed Richard, "and you will. As soon as we get back home, I will contact Aunt Christine myself. I promise." The conversation continued for over an hour, with the girls expressing their frustrations and Richard listening patiently, apologizing when necessary and committing to concrete changes. Michael remained silent throughout the discussion, watching the man he had hated for 2 decades reveal himself to be surprisingly human. As the conversation was coming to an end, Jessica turned to Michael. "Mr. Michael, you have been wonderful to us. How can we thank you?" "Seeing you reconcile with your father is thanks enough," Michael replied sincerely. "Really," added Richard, "I don't know how I can repay your kindness. If it weren't for you, they could have been in much worse situations on the road." Michael looked directly into Richard's eyes. For a second he considered revealing everything right then. To say who he was, to tell the whole story, to confront the man who had destroyed his life 20 years ago. But when he saw the genuine gratitude on Richard's face, when he saw the girls happy to have reconciled with their father, Michael realized something fundamental. He no longer wanted to be a prisoner of the past. "It was a pleasure meeting you three," Michael said, standing up. "Now I'll let you sort out your family matters." "Mr. Michael, wait," called Emily. "You're leaving just like that? We don't even have your phone number." "Don't worry about me," Michael replied with a sad smile. "Take good care of each other, that's what matters." He was heading for the door when Richard called him. "Michael," the man shouted, "at least let me pay for your stay here at the hotel. It's the least I can do." Michael stopped at the door without turning around. "No need, Richard," Some things in life are priceless. And with those words, he left the hotel, leaving behind 20 years of anger and resentment. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. In the car, driving back home, Michael felt a strange mix of relief and melancholy. He had lost the opportunity to take revenge on Richard Patterson Hayes, but he had gained something far more valuable, the chance to choose who he wanted to be from that point forward. Throughout the night, as he drove along the empty roads, Michael reflected on the events of the last 2 days. He had seen Richard not as the villain of his revenge fantasies, but as a flawed and human father, struggling with the same fears and insecurities he himself carried. More importantly, he had realized how his own bitterness had shaped his choices over the years. Just as Richard had deprived his daughters of their mother's family out of fear, Michael had distanced himself from his own daughter out of wounded pride. When he arrived home in the small town where he had lived for 15 years, Michael went straight to the office and picked up the phone. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number he knew by heart, but hadn't used in over 2 years. "Hello," answered a woman's voice. "Rachel, it's Dad." The silence on the other end of the line lasted a few eternal seconds. "Dad?" His daughter's voice carried a mix of surprise and caution. "Is something wrong?" "No, honey. Actually, I wanted to talk to you. If you want to, of course." "Dad, it's almost 2 in the morning," Rachel observed. "Are you sure everything's okay?" "It is, honey. Actually, I think it's better than it has been in years. I wanted to apologize to you." Another silence, even longer. "Apologize for what, Dad?" "For being an absent father, for letting my bitterness contaminate our relationship, for depriving you of your mother's family all these years, for choosing pride over love so many times." Michael heard a muffled sob on the other end of the line. "Dad, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything right now, honey. I just wanted you to know that I recognize my mistakes and that I'm willing to do things differently from now on if you give me a chance." "Of course I'll give you a chance, Dad," Rachel replied through tears. "I was just waiting for you to take the first step. I've missed you so much all these years." The conversation lasted until dawn. Michael talked about the twins he had helped, about the lesson in humanity he had learned, about his decision to leave the past behind. Rachel talked about her life in Los Angeles, about the fiancé he hadn't met yet, about the plans she had for the future. When they finally said goodbye, it was already daylight. Michael felt lighter than he had in decades. He had chosen forgiveness over revenge, and that choice had opened doors he thought were closed forever. In the days that followed, Michael returned to his normal routine, but with a completely different perspective. He worked at a small consulting firm he had founded himself after years of rebuilding his financial life. It wasn't the dream company he had lost 20 years ago, but it was honest and gave him a decent living. Rachel called every day, and little by little they rebuilt the relationship they had lost. She said she had always held on to hope that one day her father would overcome the bitterness and become the caring man she remembered from childhood. 2 weeks after the meeting at the hotel, Michael was in his office when he received an unexpected call. "Hello, Mr. Michael. This is Jessica Patterson Hayes." Michael almost spilled the coffee he was drinking. "Jessica, how did you get my number?" "It was a little difficult, but we managed," she replied with an excited voice. "Mr. Michael, Carolina and I would really like to meet with you again. Would you have some free time this weekend?" "Well, Of course," replied Michael, confused. "Did something happen?" "No, nothing serious. It's just that after you left, we kept thinking about how important your presence was there. We kind of consider you a guardian angel, you know. And we wanted to properly introduce you to our father, maybe have lunch together." Michael hesitated. Meeting Richard again, this time knowing that he knew who Michael was, would be too complicated. "I'm not sure it's a good idea," he said finally. "Please, Mr. Michael," insisted Jessica. "It means a lot to us. You were so important at that moment, and we want our father to get to know the person who helped us better." After much insistence, Michael ended up giving in. They scheduled a lunch for the following Saturday at a restaurant in the city where Richard lived. All week, Michael wrestled with whether he should go to the meeting. Part of him was curious to see how Richard would react if he knew the truth. Another part was afraid that the revelation would ruin the reconciliation the girls had achieved with their father. On Saturday, Michael arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes late. Jessica, Emily, and Richard were already seated at a table near the window, talking animatedly. When Michael approached, they all stood up to greet him. "Mr. Michael!" exclaimed Emily, giving him a hug. "I'm so glad you came." "Thank you for accepting our invitation," said Richard, shaking his hand warmly. "Since that day at the hotel, I haven't stopped thinking about how lucky we were that you found my daughters." The lunch started pleasantly, with the girls telling how their reconciliation with their father had been over the past few days. Richard had truly changed his stance, giving his daughters more freedom and even starting preparations for them to visit their aunt in New York. "Mr. Michael, may I ask a personal question?" said Richard, when the topic of family began to run dry. "Of course," replied Michael, though his stomach had turned. "Do you have children?" "I have a daughter, Rachel. She's 27 and lives in Los Angeles." "Are you close?" Michael hesitated before answering. "We're rebuilding our relationship. I was a complicated father for many years. I let problems from the past affect my ability to be a good father." "I understand perfectly," said Richard with a sigh. "I've made that mistake too. Sometimes it's hard to separate our own frustrations from how we raise our children." "That's true," agreed Michael. "It took me a long time to understand that my daughter wasn't to blame for my problems with other people." "What kind of problems, if it's not too indiscreet?" asked Richard. Michael felt he was reaching a crucial moment. He could keep pretending, or he could finally be honest. "Professional problems," he said carefully. "Many years ago I had a small family business. A partner deceived me, took everything I had built, and I was left in ruin. The bitterness of that experience consumed me for decades." Richard put his fork down on his plate, his expression growing more serious. "That's terrible. How many years ago?" 20 years, replied Michael, his eyes fixed on Richard's face. 20 years, repeated Richard slowly. "What kind of business was it?" "Construction. Mostly small residential projects." Richard's face paled slightly. Michael saw the exact moment suspicion began to form in the man's mind. What was the name of your company?" "Gardner and Associates," Michael replied calmly. Richard dropped his fork completely, his hands trembling slightly. The girls noticed the change in their father's behavior, but didn't understand what was happening. "Dad, are you okay?" asked Jessica worriedly. Richard ignored his daughter's question, his eyes still fixed on Michael. You are Michael Gardner." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Michael confirmed simply. The silence that followed was deafening. The twins looked from one man to the other, clearly confused and beginning to get scared. "Dad, do you know each other?" asked Emily. Richard was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he tried to process the information. We had business together many years ago," he finally said, his voice almost inaudible. "No," Michael corrected calmly. "We didn't have business. You destroyed my company, Richard. You stole everything I had built." The girls looked shocked from one to the other. Jessica was the first to find her voice. "Dad, is this the Michael Gardner you always talked about? The man who tried to harm our family?" "Jessica, began Richard. "No, Dad," interrupted Emily, her puzzle pieces falling into place. "You always said this man was vengeful and dangerous, but Mr. Michael helped us when we needed it. He took care of us." Richard looked at his daughters, then at Michael, clearly in a panic. "Girls, you don't understand. The situation is more complicated than it seems. This man, he might be trying to use you to get revenge on me." "Use us?" repeated Jessica, incredulous. "Dad, you're not making sense. If Mr. Michael wanted revenge, he could have done anything to us on the road. Instead, he paid for our hotel, our food, and even convinced us to call you." "It's true, Dad," agreed Emily. "And besides, if this whole story is true, why did you never properly tell us what happened? You always talked about him as if he were a monster. But he's just a normal man. Richard was clearly desperate, realizing his version of the story was being questioned by his own daughters. "You don't know what he's capable of," he insisted. "He almost destroyed our family with lies and accusations." It was Michael's turn to speak, his voice calm and controlled. "Richard, your daughters are adults. They deserve to know the full truth. Why don't you tell them exactly how our partnership was, how you convinced me to invest my savings in the Vista Heights condominiums project, how you disappeared with the money when the problem started?" "You're lying," Richard countered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Then tell them about the documents you altered, about the bribes you paid to the city inspector, about how you transferred all the company's assets to an account in your mother-in-law's name 1 week before declaring bankruptcy." The twins watched the exchange of accusations with growing horror. It was obvious there was much more to the story than their father had told them. "Dad, is this true?" asked Jessica, her voice choked. Richard was silent for a long time, his head bowed. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. I did some things I'm not proud of, but it was to save my family. Your mother's business was failing and I needed the money so we wouldn't lose everything." "So you stole Mr. Michael's money?" pressed Emily. "I didn't steal," Richard exploded. "I needed it. You were little, your mother was sick, I had no choice." "There's always a choice, Richard," said Michael calmly. "You could have been honest with me. You could have asked for help. You could have explained the situation. But instead, you chose to deceive me and then twist the story to play the victim." "And you?" Richard retorted angrily. "Are you telling me you didn't come after my daughters for revenge, that it's pure coincidence you met them on the road?" "It was a coincidence, yes," Michael replied. "But even after I found out who they were, I could have used that information against you. I could have told them who I was that first day. I could have poisoned their minds against you. But I didn't." "Why?" asked Richard, genuinely confused. "Because they're not to blame for your mistakes, and because I'm tired of letting your wrongdoing poison my life." The restaurant was practically empty by that point, but Michael noticed a few waiters glancing discreetly at the table where the argument was happening. He turned to the girls, who were clearly shaken. "Jessica, Emily, do you want me to leave? I understand if you want to be alone with your father to process all this." "No," said Jessica quickly. "Please stay. We want to properly understand what happened." "Yeah," agreed Emily. "Our whole lives we've heard one version of the story. Now we want to hear the other." Richard looked at his daughters with an expression of despair. "You're going to believe his word over mine?" "Dad, we're going to believe the truth," Jessica replied firmly. "And from what we've heard so far, it seems you haven't been completely honest with us." For the next 40 minutes, Michael told his version of the events from 20 years ago. He talked about how he had inherited the small company from his father, about his dreams of expanding the business, about how Richard had approached him with the condominium proposal. He described how he had invested not only his savings, but also taken out loans using his house as collateral, how he had trusted Richard to manage the financial side of the project, how he discovered too late that the documents were forged and the money had vanished. "When everything fell apart, I didn't just lose my company," concluded Michael. "I lost my home, my marriage, and I almost lost my daughter too. I spent years working just to pay off the debts left over from that project." Richard listened to the entire story in silence, occasionally trying to interrupt to justify himself, but his daughters silenced him with firm looks. "Dad, is this true?" asked Emily when Michael finished. Richard sighed deeply. "The situation wasn't quite like that," he said finally. "I didn't plan to hurt anyone. Your mother's company really was in trouble, and the condominium project was our only chance to save it." "But did you deceive Mr. Michael?" insisted Jessica. I omitted some details about the project's risks," Richard admitted reluctantly. "But it wasn't theft, it was a difficult business decision." "Richard, you transferred 400,000 reais from an account that was mine to your mother-in-law's account without my authorization," said Michael calmly. "If that's not theft, then I don't know what is." The twins looked at their father with an expression of deep disappointment. "Dad, how could you do this?" asked Emily, her voice choked. "You always taught us about honesty and integrity." "I did what I needed to do to protect our family," repeated Richard, but his defense sounded increasingly weak. "No, Dad. countered Jessica. "You did what you wanted to do, and then you spent 20 years telling lies about it to feel better." The confrontation continued for a while longer, with painful truths being revealed from both sides. Richard finally admitted that he had distorted the story over the years, first to protect his young daughters, then out of shame, and finally out of pride. "I made serious mistakes," he confessed finally. "Mistakes that cost a great deal to a lot of people. But you have to understand, I was desperate." "Dad, we understand you were desperate," said Jessica. "But you could have chosen to be honest. You could have told Mr. Michael the truth, asked for help in a different way. And instead of apologizing and trying to make things right, you built a whole narrative where he was the villain," added Emily. "That's not right." Michael watched the family dynamic unfold, feeling a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction at finally seeing the truth acknowledged, sadness at seeing how that whole situation had affected the girls. "Richard, I have a proposal for you," said Michael when the conversation was losing steam. "What proposal?" asked Richard suspiciously. "Let's leave the past in the past. I won't seek revenge or reparation anymore, but in return you will be honest with your daughters from now on, and you'll stop speaking ill of me to them." Richard looked at Michael in surprise. You don't want anything in return? No financial compensation?" "Money won't bring back the last 20 years of my life," replied Michael, "and I'm tired of letting this resentment control me. I want to move on." "But Mr. Michael, that's not fair," protested Jessica. "My father hurt you a lot. He should at least apologize properly." "He should, yes," agreed Michael, "but I can't force him to apologize, and I don't need that apology to move on with my life." Richard was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with himself. Finally, he turned to Michael. I'm sorry," he said, his voice almost inaudible, "for what I did to you, to your family, for the consequences my actions had on your life." It wasn't the grand, dramatic apology Michael had imagined over the years, but it was genuine. He could see in Richard's eyes that the man truly felt the weight of his actions. "Thank you," Michael replied simply. The girls watched the exchange with emotion, clearly relieved to see the two men finally finding some kind of resolution. "So now what?" asked Emily. "Where do things stand between you two?" "I don't think we'll become friends," said Michael honestly, "but we're not enemies anymore either." It's more than I deserved," admitted Richard. The lunch ended in a strange atmosphere, a mix of relief, melancholy, and a sense of closure. When they got up to leave, Jessica hugged Michael tightly. "Thank you," she whispered in his ear, "for helping us, for being honest, for giving us the chance to know the truth." "And thank you for forgiving our father," added Emily, "even though he didn't deserve it." "Everyone deserves forgiveness, girls," replied Michael, "including you for any guilt you might be feeling about your father's mistakes." Richard approached hesitantly. "Michael, I know my word isn't worth much after everything, but I promise I will try to be a better man from now on, for my daughters especially." "That's the only promise you need to make," said Michael. They parted ways in the restaurant parking lot. Michael watched Richard and the girls get into the black Lexus and drive off, probably for a long conversation about everything that had been revealed. On the way home, Michael reflected on how the last few months had completely changed his life. The chance encounter with Richard's daughters had been the catalyst for transformations he never imagined were possible. When he got home, he found a message from Rachel on his phone. "Dad, I'm so proud of how you've been handling things lately. You seem like a completely different person. I love you." Michael smiled, putting the phone away. He really did feel like a different person. 20 years of anger and resentment had been replaced by something he had almost forgotten: peace of mind. In the weeks that followed, Michael occasionally received messages from the twins, telling him about the process of rebuilding their relationship with their father. Richard was keeping his promises, giving the girls more freedom and being more open about his own vulnerability. They had visited Aunt Christine in New York and discovered a whole maternal family they never knew. Richard had not only allowed the visit, but had accompanied them, finally facing his late wife's relatives after so many years of avoidance. 1 month after the revealing lunch, Michael received an unexpected call. "Mr. Michael, it's Richard." "Hi, Richard. Is something wrong?" "No, everything's fine. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. Would you have some time to meet? Just you and me this time." Michael hesitated. He thought the Richard Patterson Hayes chapter was finally closed in his life. "Is it about the girls?" "No. It's about you and me. There are some things that need to be said, and I didn't want to talk in front of my daughters." Curious, Michael agreed to meet Richard at a cafe in the town where the girls lived. 2 days later, they sat at a table in the back of the establishment, away from other customers. "Thank you for coming," began Richard. "I know you don't owe me anything, and I had no right to ask for this meeting." "What do you want, Richard?" Richard took a deep breath before speaking. "I want to tell you what really happened 20 years ago. The complete truth, not the version I told the girls or myself all these years." "Why?" "Because you deserve to know, and because I need to say it to someone." Richard then told a much more detailed and honest version of the events from 2 decades ago. He spoke about how his wife had discovered terminal cancer right after he had committed to the condominium project, as the costs of her treatment had consumed all the family's savings. He explained how he had honestly tried to finance the project through banks, but had been rejected due to problems with the land documentation, how he had panicked when he realized he wouldn't be able to honor his commitments to Michael. "I could have come to you and told the truth," admitted Richard. "I could have explained the situation and asked to renegotiate the contract, but I was ashamed of failing as a businessman, as a husband, as a father. So you decided to deceive me. I convinced myself I was only delaying the payment, that when the project was completed there would be enough money to repay everyone. I didn't deliberately plan to steal from you." "But you stole anyway." "I did steal," admitted Richard. "And then, when everything fell apart and you started to sue me, I went into survival mode. I began to twist the story, first to my lawyers, then to my family, and finally to myself." Michael listened to the entire confession in silence. It was more or less what he had imagined over the years, but hearing the details from Richard's mouth made it all more real and, strangely, more tragic. "Why are you telling me this now?" asked Michael. "Because after that lunch with the girls, I realized that carrying this lie for 20 years not only harmed you but also harmed me. I became a person I don't recognize, a person who lied to his own daughters to protect my pride." Richard paused, his voice choked. "And also because my wife, and before she passed, she made me promise that one day I would seek you out to apologize. She knew what I had done and was deeply disappointed in me. One of the last things she told me was that I would never be a good father to the girls while I carried this guilt. And why did it take 20 years to fulfill that promise?" "Cowardice," replied Richard simply. "Cowardice and pride." They talked for another 2 hours. Richard shared details about how he had felt over the years, carrying the weight of guilt and constructing false narratives to justify his actions. He talked about how it had affected his relationship with his daughters, his ability to trust people and be trusted by them. "I'm not trying to convince you to forgive me," said Richard, as the conversation was coming to an end. "I know forgiveness can't be asked for, only given voluntarily. I just wanted you to know that I recognize the magnitude of what I did to you." "I already forgave you, Richard," replied Michael. "I forgave you when I decided not to use your daughters against you. I forgave you when I decided to stop letting your wrongdoing poison my life." "How did you manage it?" asked Richard, genuinely curious. "How did you forgive someone who destroyed so much in your life?" Michael thought for a moment before answering. "Because I discovered that forgiveness isn't something you do for the person who hurt you. It's something you do for yourself. I was allowing you to control my life for 20 years, even without you knowing it. The anger I felt toward you was shaping every decision I made, every relationship I had." "And how did you realize that?" "Through your daughters," said Michael with an ironic smile. "They showed me that you were just a flawed man, like any other, not the monster I had created in my mind. And they made me realize I was repeating the same mistakes with my own daughter that you were making with them." Richard nodded, understanding. "The girls said you reconciled with your daughter." "They did? Michael was surprised. "They follow you on social media," explained Richard with a half smile. "They saw the photos from her visit last month. They were happy for you." "How are they?" asked Michael. "I mean, after finding out the truth about you and me?" "It was difficult at first," admitted Richard. "They were disappointed in me, questioned everything I had taught them about honesty, but they were also impressed with your reaction. They say you are an example of how they want to be, people who choose love over revenge. They are special girls. You were lucky." "I really was, and I almost threw it all away because of my pride." When they said goodbye that day, Michael felt that he had finally closed the cycle completely. He had not only forgiven Richard, but he had understood the man behind the actions that had hurt him so much. 6 months later, Michael was at his home preparing a special dinner. Rachel had arrived in the morning, bringing her fiancé to meet her father. It was the first time Michael had had visitors in years, and he was nervous but happy. The phone rang as he finished seasoning the chicken. "Hello? Mr. Michael, it's Emily." "Emily, how are you?" "Well, thank you. Mr. Michael, Jessica and I wanted to invite you to something." "What is it?" "Well, next week is our dad's birthday, 53 years old, and we wanted to have a little party for him. Nothing too big, just family and some close friends." Michael hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that level of closeness with Richard. "I don't know if it's appropriate, Emily. Please, Mr. Michael, it would be very important for us to have you there. You've kind of become part of our family too. And, well, I think it would be important for Dad too." "Does he know you're inviting me?" "It was his idea," admitted Emily. "He said that if you agreed, it would be an honor to have you at the party." Michael looked out the kitchen window, where he could see Rachel and her fiancé talking animatedly in the garden. His own life had become so rich after he decided to leave the past behind. Perhaps it was time to complete that transformation. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll go." Richard's party took place at his home, an elegant mansion on the outskirts of the city. When Michael arrived, he was warmly greeted by the twins, who introduced him to various relatives and family friends. Richard was visibly nervous, but also seemed genuinely happy to see him. They talked briefly, keeping a cordial but not forced tone. During the party, Michael watched Richard interacting with his daughters, noticing how the man had truly changed. He was more present, more attentive, more emotionally open. The girls seemed genuinely happy and at ease with their father. At one point in the evening, Richard asked for everyone's attention to make a speech. "I want to thank everyone for being here celebrating with me," he began. "This past year has been a period of many transformations in my life. I made serious mistakes in the past, mistakes that almost cost me my relationship with the most important people in my life." He looked directly at his daughters when he said this. "I learned that being a good father is not about controlling or overprotecting. It's about being present, being honest, and having the courage to admit when we are wrong." Richard then turned to Michael. "And I learned that it's never too late to try to correct our mistakes and ask forgiveness from the people we have hurt." It wasn't a long or dramatic speech, but it was sincere. Michael felt that Richard had finally found a way to apologize publicly without making the moment about himself. Later that night, as the party was winding down, Jessica approached Michael. "Mr. Michael, can I tell you a secret?" "Of course." "My dad has a photo of you with him and my daughters in his office. He told us that photo reminds him it's never too late to choose to be a better person." Michael was moved by the revelation. He thought of his own photo kept on his desk, an image of Rachel, him and the future son-in-law, taken during her visit the previous month. "And can I tell you another secret?" continued Jessica. "Go ahead." "Sometimes Emily and I imagine what it would have been like if you two had been friends when we were little. I think you have much more in common than you think." Michael looked across the room, where Richard was chatting animatedly with some relatives. It was strange to think that in another life they could indeed have been friends. Both were devoted, if flawed, fathers. Both had gone through difficult losses. Both had struggled to rebuild their lives after poor decisions. "Maybe," said Michael to Jessica. "Maybe in another life." When Michael left that night, he felt at peace with himself in a way he hadn't experienced in decades. He had found not only forgiveness, but also understanding. And most importantly, he had found a version of himself his daughter could be proud of. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. 2 years after the first chance encounter on the road, Michael was driving along the same Interstate 95 where it had all begun. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Rachel was in the passenger seat, returning from a trip to visit her maternal family, a reunion Michael had financed and encouraged. "Dad, thank you for this," she said, as they passed the exact spot where Michael had found the twins, "for helping me reconnect with Mom's family. I know it must have been hard for you." "It wasn't hard, sweetheart," Michael answered sincerely. "It was liberating." "How so?" Michael thought about how to explain the last 2 years of personal transformation to his daughter. "For a long time I thought protecting you meant controlling who you had contact with, where you could go, what choices you could make. I learned that protecting someone we love is giving them the tools and support to make their own choices. You learned that by yourself?" "No," admitted Michael with a smile. "I learned by watching a father who was making the same mistakes I was, and seeing how his daughters reacted when he changed his stance. The twins you helped." "Exactly." They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Michael had told Rachel the whole story about Richard and the girls, including their conflicted past. She was impressed by how her father had handled the situation. "Dad, can I ask you something I've always been curious about?" "Of course." "Don't you feel even a little bit of anger still, after everything that man did?" Michael considered the question carefully. "Sometimes I feel a twinge of sadness," he said finally. "Not anger, but sadness for the years we lost, for the dreams that were interrupted. But not anger. Anger requires energy I'd rather use to build new things." "How do you manage that?" Rachel was genuinely curious. "How do you manage to choose not to feel anger?" "It's not that I choose not to feel it, sweetheart. It's that I choose not to feed it. When an angry thought pops into my mind, I acknowledge it, but I don't dwell on it. Instead, I focus on something constructive." "Like what?" "Like this moment here with you. Like the plans I have for the company. Like the call I need to make to Aunt Christine next week." Rachel smiled. "Aunt Christine, their mother's sister?" "Yes. She invited me to go to New York to meet the family. Apparently, the girls talked about me so much she got curious." "And you're going?" "Yes, I am. Why not?" In fact, the relationship between Michael and the extended family had become far more complex and rich than he had ever imagined. Aunt Christine had become a sort of counselor for the twins, and through them, she had learned Michael's story. Impressed by his generosity and maturity, she had included him in several family activities. Richard had also grown closer to his late wife's family, overcoming years of resentment and wounded pride. The result was that Michael and Richard occasionally saw each other at family gatherings, maintaining a cordial and respectful relationship. They weren't exactly friends. The past between them was too complex for that. But they were two people who had learned to coexist peacefully and even respect each other. "Dad, do you think you'll ever get married again?" asked Rachel suddenly. The question took Michael by surprise. "Why do you want to know?" "Curiosity. You seem much happier lately, more open to new things, and it wouldn't be bad to have someone special in your life." Michael thought about the question. In recent months, he had gone out a few times with Susan, a retired teacher he had met through Aunt Christine. Nothing serious yet, but there was a genuine connection there. "Maybe," he said finally. "If it happens naturally, why not?" "I'm glad to hear that." They arrived at Michael's town in the late afternoon. Rachel would stay for a few days before returning to Los Angeles. As they were unloading the suitcases, Michael's phone rang. "Hello? Mr. Michael, it's Jessica." "Hi, Jessica, how are you?" "Good, thank you. Mr. Michael, I have some news to share." "Good or bad?" "Good," laughed Jessica. "I'm getting married." "Jessica, that's wonderful!" exclaimed Michael, genuinely happy. "When?" "In 3 months." "And Well, I wanted to ask you something a bit strange. What is it? Would you agree to be the best man? I know it's strange that you're technically not family, but you are very important to me and to Emily, and my father agreed it would be an honor to have you as best man. Michael was moved by the invitation. In 2 years he had gone from the family's mortal enemy to the best man at the wedding of Richard's daughter. It would be an honor for me, Jessica. Really, that's great. Emily will be so happy. After hanging up, Michael stood still in the hallway of his house, processing the magnitude of the transformation his life had undergone. 2 years ago, he was driving alone on that highway, filled with bitterness and resentment. Today he had a renewed relationship with his daughter, a romantic possibility on the horizon, and had been asked to be the best man at the wedding of the daughter of the man he had hated most in his life. "Dad, is everything okay?" asked Rachel, noticing his distant expression. "Everything's fine. Yes, honey," replied Michael with a smile. "In fact, it's better than fine. It's perfect." That night after Rachel had gone to sleep, Michael sat in his favorite living room armchair and reflected on the 2 years that had passed since the chance encounter on the highway. He thought about all the choices he had made along the way. The choice to help the girls even though he didn't know them. The choice not to use them against Richard, even after discovering who they were. The choice to forgive instead of seeking revenge. The choice to rebuild his relationship with Rachel. The choice to move forward instead of staying stuck in the past. Each of those choices had been difficult at the time, but each had led to something better, something richer, more meaningful, more human. Michael picked up the phone and made a call he hadn't made in a few weeks. "Hello?" answered a familiar woman's voice. "Hi, Susan, it's Michael." "Michael, so good to hear from you. How was the trip with your daughter?" "It was great." "Susan, would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow? I have some news to share." "Of course, I'd love to." "Great. Shall I pick you up at 7? "Perfect." After hanging up, Michael smiled to himself. It had been a long time since he felt so optimistic about the future. Not because his life was perfect, it still had challenges and complications, but because he had finally learned to face those challenges with hope instead of bitterness. 3 months later, Michael stood in a dark suit at the entrance of the church, waiting for Jessica to appear to walk down the aisle. As the one giving her away, he would have the honor of escorting her to the groom. Richard was by his side, visibly emotional and proud. In recent months, as they planned the wedding together, they had developed an unexpected partnership. Not exactly a friendship, but a respectful collaboration based on their mutual love for the girls. "Nervous?" Michael asked Richard. "Very," the other man admitted. "It's hard to see your daughters growing up." "I can imagine." "Michael, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "When Jessica told me she wanted you to give her away, my first reaction was jealousy. I thought, how could she want a stranger to play the role that should be mine?" Michael listened in silence. "But then I understood," Richard continued. "You're not a stranger. You're the man who saved my daughters when they needed it most, and who saved me too in a different way. You're family to them, and that means you're family to me too." "Thank you, Richard. That means a lot to me." The wedding march began to play, and Jessica appeared at the entrance of the church, radiant in her white dress. She discreetly waved to Michael and Richard, clearly happy to have them both there. When Michael escorted her to the groom at the altar, Jessica whispered in his ear, "Thank you for everything, Mr. Michael. For helping me that night, for forgiving my father, for showing me how love is stronger than revenge. Thank you, Jessica, for teaching me that it's never too late to start over." The ceremony was beautiful, full of love and joy. During the reception, Michael danced with Rachel, with Susan, and even with Aunt Christine, who had become one of the dearest people in his social circle. At one point in the evening, he found himself sitting at the same table as Richard, both watching the twins dancing with their respective partners. "They turned out well," Michael commented. "They did," Richard agreed, "despite our mistakes as fathers." "Not despite our mistakes, because of them too. The mistakes taught us lessons we passed on to them, even if indirectly. Richard thought about that. You're right. Jessica always says she learned about forgiveness by watching how you treated me, and Emily always talks about the importance of giving people second chances. And they learned about persistence and determination by watching how you rebuilt your relationship with them after the truth came out. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, two men who had found peace where there was once only conflict. "Michael, can I ask you a question?" Richard said finally. "Of course. Did you ever regret not seeking revenge? Did you ever think about what you could have done to me when you had the chance?" Michael considered the question honestly. "At first, yes," he admitted. "In the first few months after I found out who the girls were, sometimes I caught myself imagining how satisfying it would have been to make you suffer." "And what stopped you?" "The girls themselves. Seeing their innocence, the trust they placed in me, made me realize that using them to get revenge would turn me into the kind of person I didn't want to be." Richard nodded. "And you?" Michael asked. "Do you regret coming to me that day to tell the truth?" "Never," Richard answered immediately. "It was one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. It freed me from 20 years of guilt and lies." "And how do you feel now about us? About this strange friendship we've developed?" Richard smiled. "Honestly, I think it's one of the healthiest relationships I have. There are no pretenses between us, no hidden agendas. We met each other at our worst and chose to see the best in one another." "That's true," agreed Michael. "It's liberating, isn't it?" "Very much so." The party continued late into the night. When it finally ended, Michael was exhausted but happy. He walked Susan to her car, savoring their last moments together before she headed home. "It was a beautiful party," Susan remarked, "and you were the perfect best man." "Thank you. It was a special day." "Michael, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course. Do you think She hesitated. "Do you think our relationship is evolving into something more serious?" The question had been hanging in the air for weeks. Michael and Susan had become very close, but they still hadn't officially defined what they were to each other. "I'd like that," Michael answered honestly. "If you want it too," Susan smiled. "I do, but I have one condition." "What is it?" "That you promise me you'll keep being the person you are today. The person who chooses love over revenge, who builds bridges instead of walls." "I promise," said Michael and kissed her gently. The following year, Emily got married too, and once again, Michael was the best man. By then, he had officially become a member of the Patterson-Hayes family, participating in birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings. His relationship with Susan had also evolved. They were living together and talking about marriage. Rachel had become friends with the twins, forging connections that transcended the complicated history between their parents. On a Sunday afternoon, 2.5 years after the encounter on the road, Michael was at his home preparing a barbecue for the family. Susan was in the kitchen making salads. Rachel was helping. And Richard had arrived early with the twins and their husbands. "Mr. Michael, can I help with anything?" asked Emily's husband, a nice young man who worked as an architect. "You can go turn those sausages," replied Michael. "And stop calling me Mr. Just call me Michael." "All right, Michael. Can I ask you a question?" "Sure. Jessica and Emily told me the story of how you all met and how your relationship evolved. I'm impressed by your capacity for forgiveness. How did you develop that?" Michael paused, thinking about how to answer. "I think it was when I realized that forgiveness isn't something you do for the other person. It's something you do for yourself. As long as I was trapped in anger and resentment, I wasn't really living. I was just reacting to the past. But it must have been difficult at first." "It was. Very difficult. But every time I chose to act with generosity instead of revenge, I felt freer. And eventually the freedom became more valuable than any satisfaction revenge could have given me." Richard, who had been listening to the conversation, approached. "And believe me, his change transformed my life too," he added. "When someone truly forgives you, it gives you the courage to be a better person." "It's like you saved each other," observed the young man. "That's exactly it," agreed Michael. "We were both trapped in the past, just in different ways. I was trapped in anger and he was trapped in guilt. Forgiveness freed us both." During lunch, the conversation flowed naturally among everyone present. It was hard to believe that just a few years earlier, half of those people didn't even know each other, and the other half considered each other mortal enemies. "A toast," said Jessica, rising with her glass in hand. "To Mr. Michael, who taught us that the best families aren't necessarily the ones we're born into, but the ones we choose to build through love and forgiveness." Everyone raised their glasses, and Michael felt his heart fill with gratitude. He looked around the table, seeing faces he loved, people who had become important in his life through a series of conscious choices to be better, to forgive, to move forward. After everyone had left, Michael and Susan stayed on the porch watching the sunset. "Did you ever imagine your life would be like this when you stopped to help those girls on the road?" asked Susan. "Never," admitted Michael. "At the time, I was just trying to be a decent person. I had no idea that moment would change everything. Sometimes the biggest transformations start with the simplest gestures." "That's true. And sometimes the most unlikely people become the most important in our lives." Susan snuggled against him. "Do you have any regrets about how everything unfolded?" Michael thought for a moment. "No regrets. Some sorrows, perhaps. I'm sorry it took me so long to learn these lessons. I'm sorry for the years I lost with Rachel because of my stubbornness. I'm sorry that Richard and I wasted so much time being enemies when we could have been allies. But you wouldn't change anything. I don't know if I would. All those years of hardship brought us here. They made us the people we are today, and I really like who we've become." Susan smiled and kissed him softly. "I really like who you've become too." That night, after Susan had gone to sleep, Michael stayed awake in the living room, reflecting on the extraordinary journey his life had taken. He thought of all the people who had become important to him. Rachel, Susan, the twins, even Richard. Each of those relationships had been built through conscious choices. The choice to be vulnerable, to forgive, to give second chances, to see the best in people instead of the worst. He picked up his phone and wrote a message to Rachel. "Daughter, thank you for giving me the chance to be a better father. You have always been the most important person in my life, and I'm glad I can finally show that properly. I love you." The reply came a few minutes later. "Dad, thank you for having the courage to change. You've always been my hero, even when our relationship was difficult. I love you too." Michael put the phone away with a smile. He had learned that it's never too late to become the person you want to be. It's never too late to choose love over revenge, hope over bitterness, forgiveness over resentment. And sometimes, if you're lucky, those choices not only transform your own life, but also touch the lives of others in ways you could never have imagined. When he went to sleep that night, Michael felt profoundly grateful. Grateful for the car accident that had brought the girls to the road that rainy night. Grateful he had chosen to stop and help. Grateful he had found the strength to forgive. Grateful for the second chance life had given him to be the person he should have been all along. And as he fell asleep, he thought of the phrase Jessica had said in the toast. "The best families are the ones we choose to build through love and forgiveness." That was exactly what he had done. He had chosen his family, and it was perfect. 5 years after the initial encounter on the road, Michael was once again driving on Interstate 95. This time, however, he was heading to New York for Susan's wedding to himself. Susan had agreed to marry him 6 months ago, and they had decided to have a simple ceremony in New York, where she had more relatives. Aunt Christine had offered her home for the reception, and the entire chosen family would be present. On the passenger seat was a photo album Susan had prepared, documenting the last 5 years of their lives together. Michael stopped at the same gas station where he had stopped on that first rainy night and decided to flip through the album while refueling. The first photo showed him and the twins at their college graduation party 2 years ago. Michael had been the special guest, representing the family. The second showed last Christmas, with the whole family gathered at his home. Rachel and her husband Susan, Richard, the twins with their husbands Aunt Christine and several other relatives. There were photos of birthdays, graduations, trips, and everyday moments that documented how this unlikely group of people had become a real functional family. The last photo in the album had been taken the previous week, Michael and Richard working together in Michael's garden, preparing for a retirement party. Richard had retired from business and was planning to travel across the United States with his new girlfriend, a kind widow he had met through Aunt Christine. "You'd never think you two were once enemies," Rachel had commented when she took the photo. And it really didn't seem like it. The two men worked together with the ease of old friends, talking about everything and nothing, sharing jokes and memories. When Michael arrived in New York, he was greeted by a flurry of last-minute activities. Aunt Christine's house was being decorated for the reception, guests were arriving, and Susan was in a state of happy nervousness. "You're late," she said, kissing him when he arrived. "The traffic was terrible," Michael apologized, "but I'm here now." "How are you feeling?" asked Rachel, who had arrived the day before. "Happy," Michael answered sincerely. "Very happy." And he really was. At 57, Michael had found a happiness he didn't even know was possible. Not a happiness based on the absence of problems, but a happiness based on the ability to face problems with love, hope, and perspective. The ceremony took place in Aunt Christine's garden, under a pavilion decorated with white flowers. Rachel was the maid of honor, and Richard, surprisingly, was Michael's best man. The twins read poems during the ceremony. When Michael and Susan exchanged vows, they included promises not only to each other, but to the family they had built together. "I promise not only to love you," Michael said to Susan, "but also to love and care for the extraordinary family we have built together. I promise to continue choosing forgiveness over revenge, hope over bitterness, and love over fear." "And I promise," Susan replied, "to continue supporting you in those choices and to remind you of who you are when you forget. I promise to celebrate not only our love, but the miracle of transformation that brought all these special people into our lives." After the ceremony, during the reception, Jessica gave an emotional speech. "5 years ago," she began, "my sister and I were lost in the rain, literally and figuratively. We didn't know who we were, we didn't understand our place in the family, and we were running from problems that seemed impossible to solve." "And then an angel appeared," continued Emily, taking the microphone. "A man who could have used our vulnerability against our father, but instead chose to protect us. A man who could have sought revenge, but instead chose forgiveness." "Mr. Michael," said Jessica, now with tears in her eyes, "you didn't just save our lives that night, you saved our family. You taught us that family isn't about blood, it's about choice. It's about choosing to love even when it's hard, choosing to forgive even when it's painful, choosing to stay even when it would be easier to leave." "And Susan," added Emily, "thank you for seeing the extraordinary man that he is, and for choosing to build a life with him. You two are proof that it's never too late to find true love." The speech ended with an ovation, and Michael was visibly moved. He looked around the room, seeing faces he loved, people who had become his family through conscious choices of forgiveness and love. During the party, Richard approached Michael. "Can I speak with you privately for a minute?" They went out to the house's balcony where they could talk away from the music and conversations. "What is it, Richard?" "I wanted to give you something," said Richard, taking an envelope from his jacket pocket. It's my wedding gift for you." Michael opened the envelope and found a check for a considerable amount. "Richard, what is this?" "It's the money I owed you for 25 years, said Richard simply. "The original amount, adjusted for inflation, with interest." Michael looked at the check, surprised. "Richard, I told you I didn't want anything. We already settled that." "I know you said that, but I need to give you this. Not for you, but for me. I need to finish paying this debt, so I can move forward completely." Michael understood. It wasn't about the money. It was about Richard closing a cycle that had begun decades ago. "All right," said Michael, putting the check away. "Thank you." "No," corrected Richard. "Thank you. For everything." They hugged, a genuine embrace between two men who had found peace where once there was only conflict. The party continued into the late hours. When it finally ended, Michael and Susan sat on Aunt Christine's house balcony, watching the last guests leave. "How do you feel, Mr. Married Man?" asked Susan. "I feel Complete, answered Michael. For the first time in decades, I feel completely at peace. And do you have any plans for the future? Michael smiled. Just to live well, to love well, and to keep being grateful for everything we have. That's a good plan. It's the best plan. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. Michael, can I ask you a question? Said Susan finally. Of course. If you could go back in time and change something, would you? Michael thought for a long moment. No, he said finally. I wouldn't change a thing. All the mistakes, all the pain, all the anger, all of it was necessary to bring me here. To bring us here. Even the 20 years of bitterness? Especially the 20 years of bitterness. They taught me the value of forgiveness in a way I never would have learned otherwise. Susan snuggled against him. You are a wise man, Michael Gardner. Not wise, just grateful. For the same things. Grateful for everything. For the rain that night that brought the girls into my life. For the chance that made me stop to help them. For the courage I found to forgive. For you. For our family. For this second chance that life gave me. And for what happened with Richard. Michael thought about it. Especially for what happened with Richard. He was my greatest teacher, even without knowing it. He taught me that everyone deserves a second chance, including myself. When they finally went to sleep that night, Michael felt profoundly at peace. He had traveled an extraordinary journey, from enmity to understanding, from bitterness to gratitude, from isolation to family. And it had all begun with a simple choice, to stop and help two girls in the rain. Years later, when people asked Michael about the secret to his happiness, he always said the same thing. I learned that life isn't about what happens to you, but about how you choose to respond to what happens to you. And what's the best response? They would ask. Love, Michael would answer without hesitation. Always love. And he lived this philosophy every day, surrounded by the extraordinary family he had built through conscious choices of forgiveness, generosity, and love. It was an unlikely family born from extraordinary circumstances, but it was real and strong and beautiful, and it all began with two little girls lost in the rain and a man who chose to stop and help. End of story. Now tell us, what did you think of this story? Do you believe Michael made the right decisions in forgiving Richard? How would you react if you were in his place? Leave your opinion in the comments with sincere words. We love reading and replying to each of your messages. Don't forget to leave your like if the story touched your heart, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other emotional stories like this one. Your companionship means everything to us.